When Daniel Carter was 16, a powerful corporation destroyed his father's small repair shop with lies and corruption. They thought the boy would disappear like the business they ruined. But 20 years later, Daniel came back with one goal: to take down the empire that destroyed his family. Welcome back to my channel. Before we continue with this powerful story, make sure you subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who loves inspiring stories. And don't forget to comment below and tell me where you're watching from. Your support helps this channel grow and allows me to keep bringing you emotional stories like this one. Now, let's continue with the story. Long before Daniel Carter ever thought about revenge, before powerful corporations, lawsuits, or billion-dollar empires, there was simply a small garage on the corner of Maple Street. In the quiet town of Red Brook, the building didn't look like much. The paint on the metal doors had faded from years of sun and winter snow. The wooden sign above the entrance creaked gently whenever the wind blew through the street. But to the people who lived in Red Brook, that garage meant something important. Because above the door were 4 words the entire town trusted:
Carter et son mécanique.
Inside the garage, the air always smelled the same: engine oil, rubber tires, and warm metal. Tools lined the walls with perfect order, each wrench and screwdriver hanging exactly where it belonged. And almost every afternoon, sitting on a small wooden stool beside the workbench, was a boy named Daniel Carter. Daniel was only 10 years old, but he already knew more about engines than most adults. That was because Daniel's father, Michael Carter, believed in teaching by doing. "Hand me the 12-millimeter wrench," Michael would say without even looking. Daniel would immediately grab the right tool. Michael would grin. "See? One day you'll run this place better than I ever could." Michael Carter wasn't the richest mechanic in town. In fact, the Carter family lived in a small 2-bedroom house just a few streets away from the garage. But what Michael lacked in money, he made up for in reputation. People trusted him. If a single mother couldn't afford a repair, Michael would quietly fix the car and say, "Pay me when you can." If an elderly neighbor's engine broke down, Michael sometimes refused payment altogether. "Cars break," he would say with a shrug. "That's just life." Word spread over the years. Soon, people from neighboring towns began bringing their vehicles to Carter and Son Mechanics. Not because it was the biggest shop, but because it was the most honest one. For Daniel, the garage felt like the center of the world. Some of his favorite memories were simple ones: watching his father lean under the hood of a car while explaining how engines breathe, listening to old country music playing softly from a dusty radio in the corner, sweeping the floor after closing time while his father counted the day's earnings. Sometimes the money in the register wasn't much, but Michael never complained. "Success isn't about how big your shop is," he once told Daniel. "It's about whether people trust your name." Daniel believed every word. In his mind, the Carter garage would always be there.
Permanent.
Unshakable, like the town itself. But Red Brook was beginning to change. Over the years, the quiet town had slowly started attracting larger companies looking to expand beyond the cities. Empty land on the outskirts of town was turning into shopping centers and warehouses. New investors were arriving. With them came businesses that operated very differently from the small family shops Red Brook had always known. Daniel didn't pay much attention to those changes. To him, the world existed between school, home, and the garage, until one afternoon that seemed ordinary at first. It was late summer, and the heat inside the garage felt heavy. Daniel was helping his father replace the brake pads on a pickup truck when the sound of tires rolling slowly across gravel echoed outside. A sleek black luxury sedan pulled into the parking lot. Daniel looked up. Cars like that almost never appeared on Maple Street. The vehicle stopped near the entrance, and two men stepped out. Even from across the garage floor, Daniel could tell they weren't customers. Their suits were perfectly pressed. Their shoes looked expensive enough to reflect the sunlight. One of the men glanced around the garage slowly, studying the building as if measuring it. Michael Carter straightened up from the engine and wiped his hands with a cloth. "Afternoon," he said politely. The taller man approached with a confident smile. "Good afternoon, Mr. Carter," he said. Michael frowned slightly. "You know my name?" The man extended his hand. "Victor Lang," he said smoothly. "And I represent Titan Automotive Group." The name meant nothing to Daniel. But the moment Michael heard it, something subtle changed in his expression. Not fear, but concern. Victor Lang looked around the garage again. "You've built a respectable little operation here," he said. Michael crossed his arms calmly. "Thank you." Victor nodded toward the building. "This property sits in a very strategic location." Daniel noticed the way the man spoke. Not like a mechanic, like someone discussing a piece of real estate. Victor opened a leather briefcase and pulled out a folder. "Our company is expanding," he continued. "We're building a state-of-the-art automotive service center here in Red Brook." He placed the folder on the hood of a car. Inside was a printed document. An offer. A very large offer. Daniel didn't understand the numbers on the page, but he saw his father's eyes scan them quickly. Victor leaned slightly closer. "We would like to purchase Carter and Son Mechanics," he said. The garage suddenly felt very quiet. Michael didn't even pick up the paper. Instead, he looked around the building. The worn concrete floor, the tools he had collected over 20 years, the wooden sign above the entrance. Then he shook his head. "This garage isn't for sale." Victor seemed amused. "Most owners say that at first," he replied. Michael's voice stayed calm. "My father started this shop. I took it over after him." He gestured toward Daniel. "One day my son will run it." Victor looked at Daniel for a moment. Then he slowly closed the folder. "Well," he said, adjusting his suit jacket, "Titan Automotive always prefers cooperation." There was a brief pause. Then Victor added something that made the atmosphere in the garage suddenly feel colder. "But expansion sometimes requires adjustments." The two men walked back to their car. Within seconds, the luxury sedan pulled away from Maple Street and disappeared around the corner. Daniel looked up at his father. "What did he mean by that?" he asked. Michael stared at the road for a moment before answering. "Big companies don't like hearing the word no." Daniel glanced at the Carter and Son sign hanging above the garage door. To him, nothing had changed. The garage still stood exactly where it always had. But Michael Carter knew something Daniel didn't yet understand. That conversation had not been a friendly offer. It had been a warning. And somewhere inside a corporate office miles away, Titan Automotive had already begun making plans. Plans that would soon change the Carter family's life forever. For a few days after Victor Lang's visit, life at Carter and Son Mechanics returned to its usual rhythm. The pickup truck was finished. Customers came in for oil changes and brake repairs. The dusty radio in the corner hummed with old country songs just like it always had. But Michael Carter couldn't shake the uneasy feeling left behind by the man in the expensive suit. Late one evening, as he and Daniel were closing the garage, Michael stood at the entrance staring down Maple Street longer than usual. Daniel noticed. You think those guys are coming back? He asked. Michael forced a small smile. Maybe, he said. Maybe not. But the truth was, Michael had heard stories about Titan Automotive. Stories that didn't end well for small garages. Over the next few weeks, Redbrook began noticing changes. First came the construction equipment. Large bulldozers and trucks appeared on a vacant lot just 2 streets away from Carter and Son Mechanics. The land had sat empty for years, but now it was surrounded by tall fences and construction crews working day and night. Daniel rode his bike past the site one afternoon and saw a massive steel structure rising from the ground. A banner hung across the fence. Coming soon, Titan Automotive Service Center. The image on the banner showed a shining glass building with dozens of service bays and bright lights illuminating a modern showroom. It looked nothing like the small independent garages scattered across Redbrook. When Daniel showed the banner to his father later that evening, Michael only nodded quietly. So that's where they're building it, he said. Is it a big deal? Daniel asked. Michael wiped his hands on a rag. It means competition. But as the weeks passed, it became clear that Titan Automotive wasn't just building a garage. They were building an empire. Everywhere in town, advertisements started appearing. Billboards along the highway, flyers taped to light poles, commercials playing on the local radio station. Grand opening soon. Titan Automotive. The most advanced auto service in Redbrook. Lowest prices guaranteed. The advertisements showed smiling mechanics in spotless uniforms working in brightly lit facilities that looked more like hospitals than repair shops. Daniel began noticing customers talking about it. One afternoon, an elderly man named Mr. Higgins came into the Carter garage for his usual tire rotation. You hear about that new Titan place? He asked while Michael worked. Michael nodded. Hard not to. They're offering free inspections and half-price oil changes, Higgins said. Whole town's talking about it. Michael kept working. Well, he said calmly, cheap isn't always better. Mr. Higgins chuckled. That's true. But Daniel noticed something else in the man's voice. Curiosity. The kind of curiosity that corporations counted on. As construction continued, Titan Automotive began hiring. Huge banners appeared across town advertising jobs. Now hiring. Titan Automotive Service Center. Top pay for certified mechanics. Within weeks, several mechanics from smaller shops across Redbrook accepted the offers. Higher pay, better equipment, stable corporate benefits. Daniel overheard people discussing it everywhere. At the grocery store, the gas station, even at school when parents talked during pickup. Titan Automotive was becoming the biggest topic in town. But the biggest change happened one quiet Monday morning. Daniel arrived at the garage after school and noticed his father standing near the office desk holding a letter. Michael looked thoughtful. What's that? Daniel asked. Michael handed him the envelope. It was from their longtime parts supplier, the company that had provided Carter and Son Mechanics with engine parts, filters, and tools for nearly 15 years. Daniel read the letter slowly. Due to recent changes in regional distribution partnerships, the supplier regretfully informed them that they would no longer be able to fulfill parts orders for the Carter garage. Daniel frowned. That's weird, he said. Michael nodded slowly. Yes, it is. Later that week, another supplier called. They delivered the same message. And then another. Within 2 weeks, 3 of the Carter garage's largest suppliers had suddenly cut ties. No clear explanation, just polite apologies and vague corporate language. Michael began making calls. Some companies didn't answer. Others claimed new contracts prevented them from supplying independent shops. Finally, one supplier quietly admitted something over the phone. They signed exclusivity agreements with Titan Automotive, the man said. We're not allowed to sell parts to shops that compete with them in Redbrook anymore. Michael thanked him and hung up the phone slowly. Daniel watched his father carefully. Dad, are they doing this on purpose? He asked. Michael didn't answer immediately. Instead, he looked out the garage window toward the construction site down the street. The Titan Automotive building was nearly finished now. Bright red banners hung from the front. Huge glass windows reflected the afternoon sunlight. It looked powerful, modern, unstoppable. Michael finally turned back toward Daniel. Big companies play a different kind of game, he said quietly. Daniel didn't fully understand what that meant, but he could feel something changing. The Carter Garage had always been part of Redbrook, a trusted place people depended on. Now, suddenly, it felt like a small boat drifting in water where a giant ship had just arrived, and the ship didn't seem to care what was in its way. At first, the arrival of Titan Automotive didn't seem to change much at Carter and Son Mechanics. The garage still opened at 7 every morning. The same regular customers still came by. Engines were still lifted, repaired, and lowered back into cars that rolled out onto Maple Street just like they had for years. To Daniel, life felt almost the same. But Michael Carter began noticing things that others didn't. Small things. The kind of changes that slowly build into bigger problems. It started with the suppliers. One Thursday afternoon, Daniel was sweeping the garage floor while Michael worked under the hood of a blue sedan. The delivery truck from their usual parts supplier was supposed to arrive that morning with brake pads and filters. But it never came. Michael checked the clock again. That's strange, he muttered. He walked into the office and picked up the phone. Daniel could hear only one side of the conversation. Hey Tom, just checking on the delivery today. Yeah, the brake kits. There was a pause. Michael's expression changed slightly. Oh, I see. Another pause. No, that's all right. I understand. He hung up the phone slowly. What happened? Daniel asked. Michael leaned against the desk. They can't deliver to us anymore, he said. Why? Michael hesitated. They signed a contract with Titan Automotive. Daniel frowned. So they can't sell parts to us? Not anymore. Daniel didn't understand how that made sense. The Carter Garage had bought parts from that company for 15 years. But Michael simply nodded quietly. Looks like we'll need a new supplier. Over the next week, Michael called several other distributors. Some didn't return his calls. Others politely told him they were already committed to larger corporate partners. Eventually, Michael managed to find a smaller supplier from another county willing to deliver parts once a week. But it meant higher costs and longer wait times. Still, Michael refused to complain. We'll make it work, he told Daniel. But that wasn't the only change happening in Redbrook. Titan Automotive was preparing for its grand opening. The massive glass building was now finished, standing like a giant beacon just 2 streets away from the Carter Garage. At night, bright lights illuminated the building so strongly that Daniel could see the glow from blocks away. Large red banners hung across the entrance. Grand opening this Saturday. Free inspections. Half-price service. On the morning of the grand opening, Daniel rode his bike past the Titan facility on his way home from school. He almost couldn't believe what he saw. The parking lot was packed. Music played from large speakers near the entrance. Employees wearing matching uniforms greeted customers at the door. Food trucks lined the street. It looked more like a festival than a garage. A giant inflatable arch stood at the entrance reading, "Welcome to the future of auto repair." Daniel watched families walk inside, smiling and curious. Some of them were people he recognized, people who had been customers of Carter and Son Mechanics for years. That evening, Daniel told his father what he had seen. Michael listened quietly while cleaning his tools. "Sounds like quite an opening," he said. "Do you think people will stop coming here?" Daniel asked. Michael paused before answering. "Some might, but not the ones who know us." Daniel nodded. That made sense to him. Trust mattered. But over the next few weeks, something began happening. The Carter garage slowly became quieter. The parking lot that once held 5 or 6 vehicles at a time now sometimes had only one. Regular customers still came. Mr. Higgins still brought his truck. Mrs. Delgado still came every few months for maintenance. But others began disappearing. Daniel overheard conversations around town. "Titan has better equipment. They're cheaper. They're faster." One afternoon, while Michael worked on a customer's engine, a middle-aged man stepped into the garage looking uncertain. "You Michael Carter?" he asked. "That's me," Michael replied. The man crossed his arms. "I heard you've been using counterfeit parts," he said bluntly. Daniel froze. Michael slowly stood up. "That's not true," he said calmly. "That's not what people are saying," the man replied. Michael gestured toward the shelves of parts behind him. "You're welcome to check every single one." The man hesitated. Then he shook his head. "Never mind." He turned and walked out. Daniel watched the man drive away without another word. When he looked back at his father, Michael was already returning to work. But Daniel could see something different in his father's expression now. Not anger, worry, because rumors were spreading across Redbrook. Rumors that someone had started. Someone powerful. A few days later, Daniel saw something else. Across the street from the Carter garage, a large billboard had been installed overnight. Bright red letters stretched across it. "Titan Automotive, Redbrook's most trusted repair service." Below the slogan was a line that made Daniel's stomach twist. "Don't risk your family's safety with outdated mechanics." Michael stood in the garage doorway staring at the billboard for a long time. Daniel stood beside him. Neither of them said anything, but both of them understood exactly what it meant. Titan Automotive wasn't just trying to compete. They were trying to replace Carter and Son Mechanics entirely. And the worst part was, they were just getting started. At first, the rumors about Carter and Son Mechanics moved quietly through Redbrook. Like most rumors in small towns, they didn't start loudly. They began as small conversations between neighbors, whispers, questions, doubts. And before long, those whispers started reaching the garage. One afternoon, Daniel was helping his father install a new alternator when Mrs. Delgado walked into the shop. She had been a customer for years. Michael greeted her with his usual warm smile. "Afternoon, Mrs. Delgado. What seems to be the trouble today?" But instead of handing him her keys like she normally did, she hesitated. I actually just came to ask you something," she said. Michael wiped his hands and walked closer. "What's on your mind?" Mrs. Delgado looked uncomfortable. "Well, my neighbor told me she heard something about your shop." Daniel immediately felt a knot tighten in his stomach. "What did she hear?" Michael asked calmly. Mrs. Delgado lowered her voice. "They're saying some of the parts used here aren't certified." Daniel's heart sank. Michael stood very still for a moment. Then he walked over to the shelf where the replacement parts were stored. He picked up a box and showed her the manufacturer's label. "Every part in this shop comes from certified suppliers," he said. "Always has." Mrs. Delgado nodded slowly. "I figured as much," she said. But Daniel could tell something had changed. Even loyal customers were starting to question what they heard. And the rumors were spreading faster every day. Within a week, the whispers had become open conversations across town. People talked about it in grocery stores. They talked about it at gas stations. Some even mentioned it during church gatherings. The stories kept getting worse. Someone claimed a car repaired at Carter & Son had lost its brakes. Another person insisted an engine had failed just days after leaving the shop. None of it was true, but rumors have a way of growing stronger each time they're repeated. Then the situation escalated. One morning, while Daniel was eating breakfast before school, his mother placed the local newspaper on the table. "Michael," she said quietly, "you should see this." Michael picked up the paper. Daniel leaned closer. Across the front page of the Redbrook Daily Chronicle was a headline that made his stomach drop. "Local garage under investigation for safety violations." The article mentioned Carter & Son Mechanics by name. It referenced the earlier city inspection warning. It quoted anonymous sources claiming that customers had reported questionable repair practices. Daniel looked at his father. "This isn't true," he said. Michael kept reading silently. Finally, he folded the newspaper. "No," he said calmly. "It isn't." "But people will believe it," Daniel replied. Michael didn't answer. That afternoon, Daniel saw something that made everything worse. Across the street from the Carter garage, workers were installing a giant billboard. The sign was enormous. Bright red letters stretched across the entire surface. "Titan Automotive, Redbrook's most trusted auto service." Below the slogan was another message. A message that felt less like advertising and more like a direct attack. "Don't risk your family's safety with outdated mechanics." Daniel stood on the sidewalk staring at it. The message pointed directly toward Carter & Son Mechanics. When Michael stepped outside and saw the billboard, he didn't say anything for a long time. Finally, Daniel spoke. "They're doing this on purpose." Michael nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "but we can't fight rumors with anger." "What do we do then?" Daniel asked. Michael looked at the garage. The worn floor, the tools he had spent years collecting, the customers who still trusted him. "We keep doing honest work," he said. Daniel wanted to believe that would be enough. But the next few weeks proved otherwise. Fewer customers came through the doors. Some people drove past the garage and continued down the street toward Titan Automotive instead. Daniel could see the difference every day. The Carter garage parking lot grew emptier. Meanwhile, the Titan facility was busier than ever. Bright lights glowed from its service bays late into the night. And every day, new advertisements appeared across town. But the most painful moment came one quiet afternoon. Daniel was helping his father close the shop when a man walked up to the garage door. He looked around nervously before speaking. "Mr. Carter?" Michael nodded. "That's me." The man hesitated. "I used to bring my truck here," he said. Michael recognized him. "Mr. Barnes, right?" The man nodded. "I just wanted to say, I don't believe what they're saying about you." Michael gave a small smile. "Thank you." The man shifted awkwardly. "But my wife thinks we should try Titan Automotive from now on, just to be safe." Daniel felt anger surge through him. The man quickly added, "I'm sorry. Michael simply nodded. I understand. The man walked away. Daniel stared at the empty street. How can they believe lies like that? He asked. Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked toward the glowing Titan Automotive building in the distance. Because the truth had become painfully clear. Titan Automotive wasn't just trying to compete with Carter and Son Mechanics. They were slowly destroying its reputation. And in a small town where reputation meant everything, that kind of damage could ruin a business forever. By the time winter arrived in Redbrook, Carter and Son Mechanics no longer felt like the same place Daniel had grown up in. The garage still opened every morning at 7. Michael Carter still arrived early, turned on the lights, and walked slowly through the shop checking each tool like he had done for years. But the difference was impossible to ignore. The parking lot was empty more often than it was full. Sometimes hours passed without a single car pulling into the garage. Daniel noticed it most after school. He would walk through the garage doors expecting to hear the familiar sound of engines running or customers talking with his father. Instead, he often found Michael working quietly alone. The dusty radio still played in the corner, but the garage itself felt hollow. Meanwhile, just 2 streets away, Titan Automotive looked like a completely different world. Their parking lot was always full. Bright lights illuminated the building late into the night. Cars lined up outside their service bays. Daniel saw it every time he rode his bike through town. And every time he saw it, the anger inside him grew a little stronger. One afternoon, Daniel returned to the garage to find his father sitting at the small office desk staring at a stack of papers. "What's that?" Daniel asked. Michael looked up slowly. "Bills." Daniel walked closer. The numbers on the papers made his stomach twist. Equipment payments, building loans, utility costs. Without customers coming in regularly, the garage simply wasn't making enough money anymore. Michael noticed Daniel reading the papers and quickly stacked them together. "Don't worry about that," he said. But Daniel could hear the worry in his father's voice. Then, just when things seemed like they couldn't get worse, something happened that Michael Carter could never have expected. It began on a quiet Tuesday morning. A dark sedan pulled into the parking lot. 2 men stepped out. They weren't customers. They wore official jackets with city logos on the sleeves. Inspectors. Michael walked forward calmly. "Morning," he said. "How can I help you?" One of the men pulled out a clipboard. "We're here for a compliance inspection," he said. Michael frowned slightly. "Didn't we just have one a few weeks ago?" "Yes," the inspector replied. "This is a follow-up." Michael nodded and stepped aside. "Go ahead." The inspectors walked slowly through the garage, examining everything. They checked tool storage. They examined engine parts. They photographed the chemical storage containers in the corner. Daniel watched them carefully. Something about the way they moved through the shop felt different. Less like an inspection. More like they were looking for something specific. Then one of the inspectors stopped near a shelf containing replacement brake components. He picked up a box and studied the label. "This part isn't properly certified," he said. Michael walked over. "That's impossible," he replied. He took the box and pointed to the manufacturer label. "That supplier has been certified for years." The inspector wrote something on his clipboard. "We'll need to review it," he said. Another inspector opened the cabinet where the garage stored cleaning chemicals. "These containers aren't labeled according to the newest regulation," he added. Michael looked surprised. "That regulation was introduced only 2 weeks ago." The inspector shrugged. Businesses are expected to stay updated. They continued moving through the garage, writing notes, taking photos. Daniel felt a growing sense of dread. Finally, after nearly an hour, the inspectors returned to the office. Michael waited. "What's the verdict?" he asked. The first inspector removed a document from his clipboard. "We've identified several compliance concerns," he said. Michael read the list: parts certification review, chemical storage labeling, safety documentation updates. None of them were major violations, but together they created a problem. "We're issuing a formal warning," the inspector said. Michael sighed. "How long do we have to fix everything?" 30 days, the man replied. Michael nodded. "That's reasonable." The inspectors gathered their things and walked toward the exit. Before leaving, one of them paused near the garage door. "You may want to resolve these issues quickly," he said. Michael looked at him. "Why's that?" The inspector hesitated. Then he simply shrugged. "Just advice." The two men left. Daniel watched their car disappear down the street. "Dad, that seems strange," he said. Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he walked back into the garage and stared at the tools hanging on the wall. Finally, he spoke. "Titan Automotive," he said quietly. "You think they're behind this?" Daniel asked. Michael looked toward the road. "I think they're setting a trap." Daniel didn't fully understand what that meant yet. But over the next few weeks, the inspections continued. More visits, more paperwork, more warnings, each one small enough to seem harmless. But together, they were slowly tightening around Carter and Son Mechanics like a noose. And Michael Carter knew something Daniel didn't yet realize. Titan Automotive wasn't trying to compete anymore. They were preparing to shut the Carter garage down completely. For weeks after the inspections began, Michael Carter worked harder than Daniel had ever seen him work before. Every evening after closing the garage, Michael stayed late reviewing paperwork, reorganizing storage cabinets, and relabeling every chemical container in the shop. He double-checked every tool, every part, every safety certificate. If Titan Automotive thought they could shut the Carter garage down with technicalities, Michael was determined not to give them that chance. Daniel helped whenever he could. After school, he cleaned the shelves, reorganized inventory, and printed updated safety labels. For a short time, it almost felt like they were fighting back. But something still felt wrong. The inspections didn't stop. Another city officer came the following week. Then another. Each time they found something new. A missing document, an outdated form, a minor technical rule that had recently changed. None of the issues were serious enough to shut down the business immediately, but they created a growing list of compliance concerns. One evening, Daniel asked the question that had been bothering him for weeks. "Dad, how do they keep finding these problems?" Michael sat quietly at the office desk. "Because someone wants them to." Daniel already knew who. Titan Automotive. Across town, their massive service center continued growing busier every week. Their advertisements now appeared everywhere. Billboards, radio commercials, even banners hanging along Maple Street. And one slogan appeared more than any other: the safest auto repair in Redbrook. The message was clear: trust Titan, not the old mechanic down the street. Then came the morning everything finally collapsed. It was a cold Monday. Daniel arrived at the garage before school to help his father open up, just like he often did. Michael was already inside. He stood near the workbench holding a wrench, staring at the garage door as if expecting something. Everything okay? Daniel asked. Michael nodded slowly. Just thinking. Then the sound of tires rolling across gravel broke the quiet. 3 vehicles pulled into the parking lot. 2 white city trucks, and a black sedan Daniel immediately recognized. Victor Lang stepped out. Behind him came 2 city inspectors and a uniformed official carrying a thick folder. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Michael walked calmly toward the entrance. "Morning," he said. The city official stepped forward. "Mr. Carter, following multiple compliance warnings and unresolved safety concerns, the city has issued an immediate enforcement order." Michael frowned. "What kind of order?" The official opened the folder and handed him a document. Michael read it slowly. Daniel watched his father's face change. "What is it?" Daniel asked. Michael didn't answer right away. Finally he spoke. "They're shutting us down." Daniel felt the words hit him like a punch. "What?" The official continued reading from the document. "Effective immediately, Carter and Son Mechanics is ordered to cease operations pending further regulatory review." Michael looked up. "These issues were already corrected," he said calmly. "We submitted the documentation last week." The inspector avoided his eyes. Additional violations were discovered. Michael shook his head. "That's impossible." Victor Lang stood quietly behind them, watching the conversation unfold. His expression was calm, almost satisfied. The official handed Michael another sheet of paper. "You have the right to appeal this decision," he said. "But until then, the garage must remain closed." One of the inspectors walked to the garage door. He pulled a bright red notice from his bag. Daniel watched as the man pressed the paper firmly against the metal door. "Business closed by city order." The red letters felt like a knife in Daniel's chest. The wind lifted the edges of the notice slightly as it stuck to the door. Everything felt silent. The garage, the street, even the sound of cars passing by seemed distant. Michael stood staring at the sign. 20 years. 20 years of work. 20 years of building something honest. Gone in a single morning. Victor Lang finally stepped forward. "I'm sorry things turned out this way," he said smoothly. Michael turned slowly toward him. "You did this." Victor shrugged lightly. "Titan Automotive simply believes in maintaining the highest standards." Michael's voice stayed calm, but Daniel could hear the anger beneath it. "You destroyed my business." Victor adjusted his suit. "No, Mr. Carter." He gestured toward the empty garage. "You refused a very generous offer." With that, Victor returned to his car. Within seconds, the vehicles pulled away from the parking lot. Daniel stood beside his father, staring at the red notice on the door. For the first time in his life, Michael Carter looked defeated. The garage that had once been the heart of their family was now just another closed building on Maple Street. Across town, Titan Automotive's bright lights glowed in the distance, full of customers, full of success, and Daniel Carter felt something inside him change. A quiet anger, the kind that doesn't disappear. Standing in front of the locked garage doors, Daniel made a promise to himself. One day, Titan Automotive would answer for everything they had done. After the city sealed the doors of Carter and Son Mechanics, the building on Maple Street became strangely quiet. For years, the garage had been full of life. Engines running, tools clanking, customers laughing with Michael Carter while they waited for their cars. Now the building stood dark and silent. The red notice taped to the garage door fluttered in the wind like a cruel reminder of what had been taken. Daniel walked past the garage every day on his way home from school. Sometimes he stopped across the street and stared at the faded Carter and Son sign hanging above the entrance. It felt impossible to believe that just weeks earlier the place had been full of life. Inside the Carter house, things were changing too. Without the garage bringing in money, bills began piling up quickly. The kitchen table slowly filled with envelopes, loan payments, utility bills, legal documents related to the shutdown. Michael Carter spent most evenings sitting quietly in the living room reading through paperwork. Daniel noticed how different his father seemed now. The confident mechanic who once worked 12 hours a day without complaint had grown quieter, slower. Sometimes he stared at his hands as if wondering what they were supposed to fix now. Daniel tried to help however he could. He took small jobs around town, mowing lawns, cleaning gutters, running errands for neighbors. But the little money he earned barely made a difference. The truth was simple. The Carter family had lost their main source of income. And in a small town like Red Brook, once a business closed, it rarely reopened. Weeks turned into months. The appeal Michael filed with the city moved slowly through the system. Each time he visited the municipal office, the answer was the same. The investigation is still under review. Daniel knew what that really meant. Nothing was going to change. Meanwhile, Titan Automotive continued expanding. Their service center was busier than ever. Daniel saw it every time he rode past the building. Bright lights, dozens of cars, lines of customers waiting outside. Sometimes he even recognized people who had once been loyal customers of Carter and Son Mechanics. The sight made his stomach burn with anger. But the hardest moment came one evening in late winter. Daniel returned home to find his mother sitting at the kitchen table with tears in her eyes. Michael stood near the window holding a letter. "What happened?" Daniel asked. Michael turned slowly. "That was the bank," he said. The loan for the garage building had fallen too far behind. Without income, the Carter family could no longer keep the property. The bank had decided to repossess it. Daniel felt his chest tighten. "You mean, we're losing the garage?" Michael nodded quietly. A few weeks later, a new sign appeared outside the building on Maple Street. "Property for sale." Daniel stood across the street staring at it. 20 years of his father's work. 20 years of memories. Reduced to a real estate listing. But the loss of the garage wasn't the only thing weighing on Michael Carter. The stress of everything that had happened began affecting his health. The man who once moved confidently around engines now seemed constantly tired. Some mornings he didn't leave the house at all. Other days he walked slowly through town with his hands in his pockets, avoiding eye contact with people who once greeted him warmly. Daniel could see the change clearly. Titan Automotive hadn't just taken the garage. They had taken his father's purpose. Then one night, something happened that Daniel would never forget. He woke up to the sound of his mother calling his name. "Daniel, wake up!" Daniel rushed into the living room. Michael Carter was sitting on the couch struggling to breathe. Within minutes, an ambulance arrived. Daniel sat in the hospital waiting room for hours while doctors examined his father. Finally, a doctor stepped out to speak with him. "The stress he's been under has taken a serious toll," the doctor explained. "He needs rest and time." But rest was difficult when everything in Michael's life had been taken away. Over the next few months, Michael grew weaker. The once energetic mechanic spent most of his time sitting on the front porch staring down the street. Sometimes Daniel joined him. One evening Michael handed Daniel an old photograph. It showed the day the garage first opened. The building looked freshly painted. Michael stood proudly beside the Carter and Son sign. You know, Michael said quietly, I always thought one day you'd run that place. Daniel looked at the photo, then back at his father. I still can, Daniel said. Michael shook his head slowly. No, that chapter is over. But Daniel didn't believe that. Deep inside him, the anger had never disappeared. It had only grown stronger. A few months later, on a cold spring morning, the Carter family received the news they had been quietly fearing. Michael Carter passed away peacefully in his sleep. The small funeral held in Red Brook was attended by many people whose lives Michael had helped over the years. Old customers, neighbors, friends. They spoke about his honesty, his kindness, his integrity. But as Daniel stood beside his father's grave, he could only think about one thing. Titan Automotive had destroyed more than a business. They had destroyed his family. And as Daniel looked toward the town of Red Brook in the distance, he made a silent promise. He would leave this town. He would learn everything he needed to know. And one day, he would come back. When he did, Titan Automotive would finally answer for what they had done. The morning Daniel Carter left Red Brook was quiet. The town looked exactly the same as it always had. The same streets, the same houses, the same small shops along Main Street. To anyone else, it might have looked peaceful. But to Daniel, every corner carried a memory. He walked slowly down Maple Street one last time before leaving. The old Carter and Son Mechanics building was still there. But it no longer belonged to the Carter family. The bank had sold the property months earlier. A temporary fence now surrounded the building, and a large banner hung across the front. Coming soon. Titan Automotive Service Expansion. Daniel stood across the street staring at it. Titan Automotive wasn't just replacing the Carter garage. They were expanding over it. It felt like they were erasing the Carter name completely. Daniel clenched his fists. He remembered the sound of engines in that garage. His father's voice explaining how machines worked. The pride Michael Carter had felt every time a customer drove away satisfied. All of it was gone, and the company responsible was thriving. Daniel turned away from the building and walked toward the bus station at the edge of town. His mother had already moved to stay with relatives in another city. Without the garage and without Michael, there was nothing left tying Daniel to Red Brook. But he wasn't leaving to escape. He was leaving to prepare. Before boarding the bus, Daniel took one last look at the town. "I'll come back," he whispered quietly. And this time he meant it. The first few years after leaving Red Brook were the hardest Daniel had ever faced. He moved to a large industrial city several hours away. It was a place where nobody knew his name. Nobody knew about Carter and Son Mechanics. Nobody knew about Titan Automotive. At first, Daniel took whatever work he could find. Construction sites, warehouse jobs, cleaning garages late at night. The work was exhausting, but Daniel had a purpose now. Every dollar he earned went toward one thing: education. During the day, he attended technical classes at a local community college. At night, he worked. While other students went out with friends, Daniel stayed in the library studying engineering manuals and business textbooks. He wanted to understand how companies like Titan Automotive operated, how they grew, how they controlled markets, how they eliminated competitors. The more Daniel learned, the clearer the picture became. Titan Automotive hadn't destroyed his father's garage by accident. They had followed a strategy: acquire suppliers, undercut prices, spread doubt about competitors, pressure regulators, then remove the competition entirely. It was cold, calculated, and completely legal, at least on the surface. But Daniel wasn't discouraged by what he learned. If anything, it made him more determined. Because if Titan Automotive had built an empire using strategy and power, then Daniel would have to build something stronger. Years passed. Daniel worked relentlessly. He graduated with degrees in mechanical engineering and business management. Then he joined a large automotive manufacturing company. It wasn't glamorous work at first. He started at the bottom. But Daniel absorbed everything. How supply chains worked, how service networks were managed, how corporate acquisitions were negotiated. Within a few years, Daniel began rising through the company. His work ethic impressed supervisors. His ideas improved efficiency. His strategies increased profits. But none of his colleagues understood what truly drove him. Every promotion, every success, every skill he gained was part of a larger plan. A plan that had begun the day Titan Automotive shut down Carter and Son Mechanics. 10 years passed, then 15. Eventually, Daniel Carter became known in the industry as a brilliant strategist. Investors trusted him. Executives listened to him. By the time 20 years had passed since the garage closed in Redbrook, Daniel Carter had built something remarkable. His own automotive service company. Started small, but under Daniel's leadership, it expanded rapidly. New service centers opened across several states. Customers praised the company for its honesty and transparency. Suppliers competed for contracts, and investors poured money into the growing business. The company's name was simple, Carter Automotive Services, but Daniel had never forgotten the real reason he built it. One evening, while reviewing financial reports in his office, Daniel noticed something interesting. A familiar name appeared in an industry report. Titan Automotive Group. The corporation that had once seemed untouchable was beginning to struggle. Expansion had stretched their resources thin. Customer complaints were increasing. Their stock price had started to decline. Daniel leaned back in his chair and stared at the report. For 20 years, he had prepared for this moment. 20 years of learning. 20 years of building. 20 years of waiting. He picked up the phone and called his executive team. "I think it's time," he said calmly. "Time for what?" one of them asked. Daniel looked out the window at the city skyline. Time to go back to Redbrook, because the empire that had destroyed his father's life was about to face the one competitor it had never expected. The boy whose future they had tried to erase. Daniel Carter was finally ready to come home. 20 years had passed since the doors of Carter and Son Mechanics were sealed shut. In those 20 years, Redbrook had changed. The town had grown. New buildings lined the streets. Several small businesses had disappeared, replaced by larger corporate chains. The quiet rural town Daniel remembered had slowly turned into a busy commercial hub. But one thing had remained exactly the same. Titan Automotive still dominated the auto repair market. Their massive service center now occupied nearly an entire city block. What had once been a single building had expanded into a sprawling complex of repair bays, administrative offices, and storage facilities. And right in the center of that complex stood a brand new structure built on the exact spot where Carter and Son Mechanics had once stood. Daniel Carter noticed it the moment his car entered town. The large sign read, Titan Automotive Redbrook Regional Center. Daniel slowed the car as he drove past Maple Street. For a moment, he pulled over to the side of the road and stepped out. The place where his father's garage once stood was now a sleek modern building made of steel and glass. Bright lights illuminated the service bays. Employees in matching uniforms moved quickly between vehicles. Customers waited in a polished lobby filled with televisions and coffee machines. To anyone else, it looked impressive. But to Daniel, it felt like standing on sacred ground that had been stolen. He closed his eyes for a moment. He could almost hear the sounds of the old garage again. The clink of tools, the hum of engines, his father's voice patiently explaining how machines worked. Then Daniel opened his eyes again. Those memories weren't gone. They were the reason he had returned. Back in the car, Daniel drove toward a hotel downtown where his executive team was waiting. The conference room was filled with charts, laptops, and reports. Several members of Carter Automotive Services had arrived earlier that morning to prepare. When Daniel walked in, the room fell silent. One of the executives spoke first. "You saw the facility?" Daniel nodded. "They've grown bigger than we expected." A younger analyst pointed to a chart on the screen. 12 regional centers, she explained. More than 300 service locations nationwide. Another executive added, "But their growth has created problems." Daniel leaned forward. "What kind of problems?" The analyst switched to another slide. Customer complaints, supplier disputes, declining stock value. They expanded too fast, she explained. Quality control dropped. Several lawsuits are already pending. Daniel studied the numbers carefully. For years he had followed Titan Automotive's expansion quietly. Now the weaknesses were becoming clear. Another executive spoke. "There's something else." He handed Daniel a report. 12 months ago, Titan Automotive took out a massive loan to fund another expansion project. Daniel scanned the document. "If revenue drops," he began, "they'll struggle to cover the debt," the executive finished. Daniel leaned back in his chair. This was exactly what he had been waiting for. For 2 decades he had studied Titan Automotive, their business model, their tactics, their weaknesses, and now those weaknesses were beginning to appear. But Daniel wasn't interested in simply competing with Titan. He wanted something more. Justice. "Phase 1 begins tomorrow," Daniel said calmly. The team looked up. "We've already secured the land for our new Redbrook Service Center," he continued. An executive smiled. "The building permit was approved this morning." Another member of the team added, "Construction crews are ready." Daniel nodded. "And the suppliers?" "All contracts finalized." The analyst turned the screen again. Several large automotive parts manufacturers had already signed agreements with Carter Automotive Services. Exclusive agreements. Daniel couldn't help noticing the irony. 20 years earlier, Titan Automotive had used supplier contracts to isolate his father's garage. Now those same tactics would be used against them. One executive asked the question everyone in the room was thinking. "Daniel, do they know who you are?" Daniel shook his head.
No.
The Carter Automotive brand had expanded nationally, but few people connected the name with the small mechanic shop that had once existed in Redbrook, and Daniel intended to keep it that way for now. "Let Titan believe we're just another competitor entering the market," he said. The team nodded, but Daniel had something else planned, something far more personal. Later that evening, Daniel walked alone through downtown Redbrook. The town looked familiar yet different. New restaurants, new stores, new faces, but the memories remained. He eventually found himself standing once again on Maple Street. Across the road, the Titan Automotive Complex glowed brightly under the night lights. Employees worked late in the service bays. Customers came and went. The empire that had destroyed his father's life still thrived. For now, Daniel slipped his hands into his coat pockets and stared at the building. "Enjoy it while you can," he said quietly, because the boy Titan Automotive had tried to erase had finally come back. And this time he hadn't come alone. He had come with an empire of his own. And Titan Automotive was about to discover what it felt like to face the same kind of pressure they had once used to destroy others. The next morning, Redbrook woke up to news that no one expected. Across the highway, just a few miles outside town, construction crews had begun clearing land for a massive new building. Huge trucks rolled across the dirt. Steel frames were delivered. Surveyors moved across the property with blueprints in their hands. Within hours, a large sign appeared at the entrance of the site. "Coming soon, Carter Automotive Service Center." People driving past slowed down to look. The name Carter Automotive was unfamiliar to most residents of Redbrook. But the size of the project made one thing clear. This wasn't a small repair shop. It was going to be a direct competitor to Titan Automotive. Inside Titan's Redbrook headquarters, the reaction was immediate. Executives gathered in the glass conference room overlooking the main service floor. Through the windows, they could see rows of vehicles being repaired while mechanics moved quickly between workstations. Victor Lang stood at the head of the table. He was older now. His hair had begun turning gray, but his confidence hadn't faded. "Who are they?" he asked sharply. A younger manager pulled up a report on the screen. "Carter Automotive Services," she said. "Rapidly expanding company. They've opened dozens of service centers across the country in the last decade." Victor studied the report. "Where did they come from?" "No one's entirely sure," she admitted. The company rose quickly. Strong reputation for honesty and customer satisfaction. Victor leaned back in his chair. "That sounds inconvenient." Another executive spoke up. "They've already secured contracts with several major parts suppliers." Victor frowned. "Which suppliers?" The list appeared on the screen. Victor's expression hardened. Some of Titan's own suppliers were on that list. "Exclusive contracts?" he asked. "Yes." Victor tapped his fingers slowly on the table. This was a problem. Titan Automotive had spent years building supply chains that smaller garages couldn't compete with. Now another company was using the same strategy against them. But Victor wasn't worried yet. He had crushed competitors before. "We'll handle it the same way we always do," he said. "How?" Victor smiled slightly. "Pressure." Meanwhile, Daniel Carter stood on the construction site watching workers assemble the steel framework of the new Carter Automotive Center. The building would be larger than Titan's Redbrook facility. Modern, efficient, designed with the newest technology. But the building itself wasn't Daniel's real weapon. His real strategy had already begun weeks earlier. Across the country, Carter Automotive representatives had been quietly negotiating contracts with the same suppliers Titan depended on. Parts manufacturers, equipment distributors, logistics companies, and many of those companies had signed exclusive agreements. Daniel had learned that strategy from Titan itself. Cut off the supply chain, and even the strongest companies begin to struggle. Later that afternoon, Daniel met with his executive team. "How are Titan's numbers looking?" he asked. An analyst opened a financial report. "Not great," she said. "Explain." 12 months ago, Titan borrowed nearly $2 billion to finance new expansion projects. Daniel nodded. He already knew that. "What happens if their revenue drops?" They'll struggle to cover loan payments. Daniel leaned forward. And if suppliers start prioritizing our contracts? The analyst smiled. Delays, higher costs, slower repairs. Exactly what Daniel wanted. Meanwhile, something else was happening inside Titan Automotive. Customers had begun noticing longer wait times. Some replacement parts were suddenly unavailable. Repairs that once took hours now took days. Customer complaints began appearing online. Slow service, higher prices, declining quality. Titan executives blamed temporary supply disruptions. But the truth was far more dangerous. Their entire supply network was slowly shifting toward Carter Automotive. Exactly as Daniel had planned. One evening, Victor Lang reviewed the latest financial reports. He stared at the numbers in disbelief. Revenue had dropped for the third consecutive quarter. Repair delays were increasing. Customer satisfaction ratings were falling. Victor slammed the report onto his desk. This Carter company is interfering with our suppliers, he growled. An assistant nodded. We believe they're offering better contracts. Victor paced across the room. They're trying to squeeze us. He stopped at the window overlooking the service center. Hundreds of employees still worked under Titan's brand. An empire he had helped build. And now someone was challenging it. Victor turned toward his assistant. Find out who runs Carter Automotive. The assistant hesitated. There's very little public information about the CEO. Victor's eyes narrowed. That's impossible. But the truth was simple. For 20 years, Daniel Carter had built his company quietly, without drawing attention, without revealing his personal story, because Daniel didn't want Titan Automotive to know who he was. Not yet. Back at the construction site outside Redbrook, the steel skeleton of Carter Automotive's new service center continued rising into the sky. Workers installed the final beams as cranes lifted equipment into place. Daniel stood nearby watching the building grow. 20 years earlier, Titan Automotive had destroyed a small garage run by an honest mechanic. They had believed that once the garage was gone, the Carter name would disappear forever. But they had been wrong. Now the Carter name was returning. Bigger, stronger, and far more dangerous than Titan had ever expected. Daniel looked toward the distant Titan Automotive complex glowing under the night lights. Your turn, he said quietly, because the empire that had once crushed his family's dream was finally beginning to crumble. By the time the Carter Automotive Service Center in Redbrook officially opened its doors, the entire town was talking about it. The building was enormous. Bright glass walls reflected the morning sunlight, and the modern facility looked more like a high-tech engineering lab than a traditional repair garage. Rows of spotless service bays stretched across the floor, filled with the newest diagnostic equipment and repair systems. Outside, a long line of cars waited for the grand opening. The banner above the entrance read, Carter Automotive Services, Redbrook. But what really caught the attention of the town was the slogan printed beneath the name. Honest work, fair prices, trust your mechanic. Many older residents of Redbrook felt something strangely familiar about those words. Across town, Titan Automotive was already feeling the effects. Customers who once automatically drove to Titan were now curious about the new facility. Some people visited simply to see what the new company offered. Others came because they had heard something surprising. The service was faster, the prices were fairer, and the mechanics took time to explain repairs instead of rushing customers through the process. Within weeks, the difference became impossible to ignore. Cars began filling the Carter Automotive parking lot every day. Meanwhile, Titan Automotive's once crowded service bays began to sit partially empty. Inside Titan's headquarters, the mood had turned tense. Victor Lang sat in the same conference room where he had once confidently dismissed Carter Automotive as just another competitor. Now the reports in front of him told a very different story. Customer numbers were dropping. Revenue was declining faster than expected. And the supply chain problems were getting worse. One executive spoke nervously. Several suppliers have shifted priority deliveries to Carter Automotive. Victor slammed his hand on the table. How is that possible? They're offering better contracts and long-term partnerships. Victor leaned back in his chair. Something about this situation bothered him. Carter Automotive wasn't behaving like a normal competitor. Their strategy felt personal. Another executive cleared his throat. There's something else you should see. He turned the screen toward the room. A news report appeared. The headline read, "Local investigation reveals Titan Automotive used unfair business practices in small-town expansion." Victor's face darkened. What is this? The executive continued reading. Several journalists had begun investigating Titan Automotive's history of expansion across smaller towns. Former employees had come forward. Independent mechanics who had lost their businesses spoke publicly about aggressive tactics. Supplier contracts designed to eliminate competition. Pressure on regulators. And suspicious inspection campaigns against small repair shops. The story quickly gained national attention. For years, Titan Automotive had operated in the shadows of corporate legality. Now those tactics were finally being exposed. Victor stood up angrily. "This is nonsense," he snapped. But the damage had already begun. Social media exploded with criticism. Customers started questioning Titan's reputation. Regulators announced formal investigations into the company's business practices. And suddenly, Titan Automotive wasn't the respected industry giant it once appeared to be. It was becoming a symbol of corporate greed. Meanwhile, inside Carter Automotive's Redbrook facility, Daniel Carter quietly reviewed the same news report. His executive team watched the television as reporters discussed Titan Automotive's controversial history. One of Daniel's colleagues turned toward him. "You knew this would happen." Daniel nodded slowly. When people finally look closely enough, the truth tends to appear. But Daniel hadn't leaked the information himself. He hadn't needed to. Titan Automotive had created its own trail of evidence over the years. All Daniel had done was give investigators and journalists the opportunity to see it clearly. That evening, as reporters continued covering the story, something unexpected happened. The journalists uncovered one final piece of information. Something that stunned the entire town of Redbrook. The founder and CEO of Carter Automotive Services was originally from Redbrook, and his name was Daniel Carter, the son of the mechanic whose small garage had once stood exactly where Titan Automotive had built their expansion facility. The same garage that had been shut down after a series of suspicious inspections nearly 20 years earlier. News cameras quickly arrived in Redbrook. Reporters began connecting the story. A small-town mechanic destroyed by a powerful corporation. A young boy who left town with nothing. And the successful entrepreneur who had now returned to challenge the very company responsible. Inside Titan Automotive headquarters, Victor Lang stared at the television in disbelief. The face on the screen was older now. Confident. Successful. But Victor recognized him immediately. The quiet boy who had once stood inside the Carter garage all those years ago. Victor whispered the name slowly. Daniel Carter. Across town, Daniel stood alone outside the Carter Automotive building watching the sunset over Redbrook. For 20 years, he had carried the memory of the day Titan Automotive shut down his father's garage. For 20 years, he had worked toward this moment. Now the truth had finally come out, and the empire that once seemed untouchable was finally facing justice. The story spread across the country faster than anyone in Redbrook expected. News stations replayed the same headline again and again. Small-town mechanic's son returns to challenge corporate giant. The story captured people's attention because it felt like something out of a movie. Powerful corporation, a destroyed family business, and a boy who spent 20 years preparing for justice. For many viewers, it was inspiring. For Titan Automotive, it was a disaster. Within weeks, the company found itself facing investigations from multiple regulatory agencies. Financial auditors began examining years of corporate expansion records. Journalists continued interviewing former employees and small business owners who had lost everything during Titan's aggressive growth campaigns. The deeper investigators looked, the worse the picture became. Evidence surfaced showing how Titan had pressured suppliers into exclusive contracts designed to isolate independent garages. Internal emails revealed executives discussing ways to accelerate regulatory scrutiny against smaller competitors. And one particular case kept appearing in every report: the shutdown of Carter and Son Mechanics in Redbrook. The same inspection campaign that had once seemed like a routine regulatory action now looked very different under national attention. For Titan Automotive, the consequences were immediate. Their stock price collapsed. Investors began pulling out. Major suppliers canceled contracts to protect their own reputations. And several executives resigned within weeks. Victor Lang watched it all unfold from his office. The once confident executive who had overseen Titan's expansion now spent most days staring at legal notices and financial warnings. The empire he helped build was collapsing piece by piece. And deep down, Victor knew exactly who had triggered it. Meanwhile, life in Redbrook was changing again. Carter Automotive Services had quickly become the town's most trusted repair center. Customers appreciated something they hadn't realized they missed: honesty. Mechanics took the time to explain repairs. Prices remained fair. And the company offered free maintenance checks for elderly residents of the town. Daniel insisted on that policy personally, because it was something his father would have done. One quiet afternoon, Daniel walked alone down Maple Street. The town looked peaceful in the warm afternoon sunlight. He stopped at a small park near the edge of town. At the center of the park stood a newly installed bronze plaque. Daniel had arranged for it to be placed there quietly, without ceremony. The plaque read, "In memory of Michael Carter, a mechanic who believed honesty mattered more than profit." Beneath the inscription were a few simple words:
Carter et son mécanique 1985-2005.
Daniel stood silently in front of the plaque. For a moment he closed his eyes. He could still picture the old garage, the smell of engine oil, the sound of tools clinking together. His father explaining how every engine tells a story if you listen closely. Daniel smiled softly. "I did it, Dad," he said quietly. Not because he had destroyed Titan Automotive. That had never really been the goal. What mattered was something much simpler. The Carter name had returned to Redbrook. And this time it wasn't just a small garage. It was a company built on the same principles his father had always believed in: honesty, hard work, respect for people. As Daniel turned to leave the park, he noticed something that made him pause. Across the street, a young boy stood outside the Carter Automotive building watching mechanics work inside the open service bays. The boy looked fascinated, exactly the way Daniel once had when he watched his father repair engines. One of the mechanics noticed the boy and waved him closer. "Want to see how an engine works?" the mechanic asked. The boy nodded excitedly. Daniel watched for a moment before continuing down the street. The Carter story was no longer about revenge. It had become something better, a second chance. Because sometimes justice doesn't mean destroying your enemies. Sometimes justice means rebuilding what they tried to take away. And in the town of Red Brook, the Carter name would never disappear again. The end. If this story kept you watching, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the story channel, and share it with someone who believes that the truth always finds its way out. Thank you for watching, and remember, sooner or later, karma always comes around.